So the big rule here, I didn't finish it. Okay, for a greater than 0, so the assumption is a is a real number. Like you could locate it on the number line. You can't locate imaginary numbers on the number line that you're used to. The big rule is this. For a greater than 0, real number a greater than 0, the square root of negative a is I times the square root of a. That's the big rule. So where does this come from? Well, think about it this way, and it might make sense to you. You could think of the square root of negative a as the square root of negative 1 times a, right? And then if that property holds that you can break up the radical over multiplication, don't you get the square root of negative 1 times the square root of a? But what's the square root of negative 1? I. So that's all we're saying. Okay? We're saying the square root of negative a is equal to I times the square root of a. In other words, you poke the I out. Poke the I out. It's all fun and games until you poke it, until someone pokes an eye out. Poke the I out. So the square root of negative 4, you always poke the I out first, you guys. So if you use that property above, how could you rewrite the square root of negative 4? You could rewrite it as I times root 4. But wait a minute, you know how to take the square root of 4. What's the square root of 4? 2, so you could say I times 2 is the answer, but most people write 2 times I. You don't even need the multiplication symbol, just 2i. And by the way, you don't need to show this work. You don't need to show it in this case. So just go right to the answer. Square root of negative 4 is 2i. So if you were explaining this to a friend, you would just say, hey, take the square root of 4 as usual, and then slap on an extra factor of I, right? If you want to take the square root of negative 8, just simplify the square root of 8 as usual. And then remember, on the outside of the radical, that's very important, you put on an extra factor of I. You multiply by I. Now, just to show you why that works, okay, square root of negative 8 according to that big property would be, in terms of I times square root 8. Oh, but you know how to simplify the square root of 8. The square root of 8, what's the biggest perfect square that's a factor of 8? 4, so 2 squared, right? 2 squared times 2. You could write it as 4 times 2, that's fine. And then once you take out the you can break up the radical over multiplication, take out the square root of 2 squared, which is 2, and I would pull the I out in front like that. So you get 2i rad 2. That's your answer. So again, you simplify as the root as usual if you're asked to simplify, and then remember, put on the outside of the radical, put on an extra factor of I. So that's not actually, doesn't seem that new now, does it? It's just kind of one extra step.